Moving on to the fifth factor, so the time consideration after a price change. And what we mean by this time consideration is basically consumers either have more time to adjust to a price change, or consumers have less time to adjust. Certain terminology you might see come up for both of these is this here is called long run elasticity. So what's happening to the elasticity in the long term, the more time there is to adjust to price changes, versus short run elasticity, or elasticity of demand in the short term. So if consumers have more time to adjust, basically what this means here is there's less urgency, or less deadlines. Versus here, if consumers have less time to adjust, there's more urgency, more deadlines. So a good example of this is seasonal products. So if you think about, let's say, a winter jacket. Let's say that you're buying the winter jacket in the summer. So that would mean that you have more time to adjust your decision, because that winter jacket is not in season, it's summertime, versus if you're buying it in the winter. Now in the summertime, let's say that that winter jacket goes up in price. Let's say that in both scenarios. Let's say that that winter jacket goes up in price in the summer, it goes up in price in the winter. The demand is going to go down. There's always that inverse relationship. So in both scenarios, the demand is going to go down. But in which scenario is the demand going to go down more? In the summer or in the winter with a price increase of a winter jacket? Well, the demand is going to decrease more in the summer, because you don't need that winter jacket right there and then. You have more time to adjust. There's less urgency. And so with that same price increase, that demand decrease is going to be larger than versus in the winter when you have less time to adjust. So because that demand is changing more, here the goods are going to have a higher elasticity of demand. Versus if there's less time to adjust, if that winter jacket goes up in price in the winter, again, the demand is still going to decrease, but it's not going to decrease by the same or as much as it did in the summer, because it's in season. And so that demand is going to be more inelastic or less elastic. So related to this is, again, seasonal products. So if there's off-peak demand, versus here if it's peak demand. Now this doesn't necessarily have to relate to just seasonal products. It could relate to goods that are used all year round. So a good example is gas prices. So let's say that you're traveling to work, you're driving to work every day, and so you're using gas every day. And let's say all of a sudden there's an increase in gas prices. Well, you're driving to work every day, so you're going to have less time to adjust to those increasing gas prices. And so that demand is not going to go down as much, right? There's still more urgency there because you're driving to work every day. You need to go to work. And so in the short run, that increase in gas prices, the good gas is going to be less elastic in the short run. But as we mentioned, over time, elasticity of demand just in general does increase. So if those gas prices continue to stay high and continue to rise, then over the long run, what's going to happen is you're going to start thinking of other options. You may start taking public transit, or you may move closer to work where you can walk. And so in the long run, those gas prices are going to become more elastic, right? But in that short term, if you're driving to work every day, more urgency, less time to adjust, that rise in gas prices isn't going to create as significant of a drop in demand versus in the long run when you have more time to adjust your options. And then the final factor we'll talk about is consumer habits. And this is actually kind of related to the previous factor of that time consideration. And basically with consumer habits, basically that saying old habits die hard, or it's tough to change old habits. So if there is more habitual spending, if you're used to buying something on a frequent basis, if that price increases, your demand for it is not going to decrease as much. So the more habitual spending there is on a certain product, the less elastic that demand is going to be. Versus the less habitual spending, the more elastic. And the reason why this here relates to that fifth factor of time consideration is because the more habitual spending there is, if you're buying something every day, the less time you're going to have to adjust to a price change because it's more of a habit. It's tougher to change that habit in the short term, right? So the less elastic that product's going to be, the less elastic the demand's going to be. So an example of this is if you have like coffee every day versus here, let's say you're not a big coffee drinker, let's say you have coffee once a week. So in both of these scenarios, let's say that the price of coffee increases. So if the price of coffee increases, if you have coffee every day, the demand for that coffee is not going to decrease as much. So that demand is going to have less elasticity because it's more of a habit. It's tougher to change in the short term and maybe go to another option like drinking tea, for example. Versus here, if you're having coffee once a week, price of coffee increases, then it's easier for you to go to another substitute or another option like tea, for example, right? So the more habitual the spending, the less elastic. The less habitual spending, the more elastic that demand is going to be for that certain product. And that's pretty much a wrap for all of the factors. So we went over 6 factors. Again, as I mentioned, you may have to adjust the list according to the source that you're using, the textbook, or how your prof is going through it. But for the most part, you'll see these factors come up in all the sources out there.